My wife, Dominique, and I have never been thrill seekers. We're not the kind of people who jump out of airplanes or climb mountains without ropes. We're pretty ordinary. We enjoy hiking, go camping a few times a year, and spend most of our evenings watching wilderness survival videos from the safety of our couch. But last year, we both happened to have 2 weeks off at the same time. One night, while talking about how we always dreamed of doing something adventurous but never actually followed through, we stumbled across a video about a 24-hour wilderness challenge. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Then it sounded exciting. And before we knew it, we were booking flights to Brazil. Now, before anyone imagines us deep in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, that's not what this was. We had signed up for a guided ecotourism experience located on the outer edges of the rainforest. It was designed specifically for travelers who wanted the thrill of surviving in the jungle without exposing themselves to serious danger. At least, that's what we believed. The guide who escorted us into the jungle seemed trustworthy. He showed us how to build a basic shelter, explained which plants and animals to avoid, and pointed out a marked trail that led back to the base camp. Before leaving, he smiled and assured us he'd return exactly 24 hours later. Everything felt safe. Everything felt controlled. And for the first several hours, everything was perfect. The jungle was unlike anything we had ever experienced. Strange birds called from unseen branches high above us. Humid air carried unfamiliar scents through the dense trees. Every direction looked endless, as if the forest stretched forever beyond what the eye could see. For the first time in our lives, Dominique and I felt truly insignificant inside something vast and ancient. As sunset approached, we finished setting up our shelter and built a small fire. We ate dinner beside the flames, took photos, laughed about how brave we suddenly felt, and joked that this would become our favorite story to tell friends back home. But when darkness arrived, the jungle changed. The sounds became louder, closer, more aggressive. The cheerful chirping of daytime creatures vanished, replaced by distant rustling, strange cries, and noises neither of us could identify. The fire suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. The shadows beyond its glow seemed deeper, hungrier. Dominique and I stayed close to the flames, talking quietly, while I continued feeding wood into the fire. For a while, everything was fine. Uncomfortable maybe, but fine. Then, sometime around 2 hours after sunset, Dominique suddenly grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. I followed her gaze toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still at the edge of the darkness, watching us. For a split second, I thought it was our guide, but almost immediately, I realized it wasn't. The silhouette was wrong, much larger, much broader, and our guide had specifically told us he wouldn't return until morning. My second thought was that it might be another tourist who had wandered off the trail, but that explanation felt wrong too. We hadn't seen another person for hours. No voices, no flashlights, no signs of anyone else being nearby. The figure remained motionless for several seconds. Then it started moving, slowly, deliberately. Each step carried it closer to the firelight, closer to us. Neither Dominique nor I spoke. Neither of us moved. The stranger finally emerged from the darkness and stepped into the orange glow of the flames. My stomach dropped instantly. The man was enormous. I'm 6 feet tall, and this guy stood several inches taller than me. His build was intimidating in a way that's difficult to describe. He seemed less like a person and more like a wall of muscle wrapped in darkness. But it wasn't just his size, it was what he was wearing. Dark tactical cargo pants, a fitted long-sleeved combat shirt, a chest rig covered in loaded pouches, a large fixed-blade knife hanging from his hip.
and strapped to his thigh appeared to be what looked very much like a holster. I tried not to stare long enough to confirm it. Then I noticed the mask. A dark, rigid mask covered the lower half of his face, hiding everything from his nose down. Only his eyes were visible, cold, expressionless, unreadable. Without saying a word, the stranger walked directly to our campfire. Then he sat down, right across from us, 8 feet away, as if he had every right to be there. The fire crackled softly between us. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The stranger leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring into the flames, completely relaxed, completely silent. Dominique's fingers tightened around my arm. I could feel her trembling. She kept looking at me, silently asking what we should do. The problem was, I had no idea. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong, yet the man hadn't actually done anything. He hadn't threatened us, he hadn't approached aggressively, he hadn't spoken. He had simply walked out of the jungle and sat beside our fire, and somehow that made it even worse. The silence became unbearable. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "Hello?" The word sounded weak the moment it left my mouth. The stranger didn't react, not even slightly. He didn't look at me, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken at all. He simply continued staring into the flames, like we didn't exist, like he was sitting alone in the middle of the jungle. Minutes passed. The fire popped and hissed. Shadows danced across his mask. And still, nothing. No movement, no conversation, no explanation. Then Dominique leaned close enough that her lips nearly touched my ear. Very quietly, she whispered, "I want to leave." I didn't hesitate. I agreed immediately. The problem was our camping gear. Most of it was scattered around our side of the fire. Packing everything would take several minutes, several very vulnerable minutes, and there was no way I wanted to spend that much time bending over backpacks while this man watched us from the darkness. So I made a decision. Forget the gear, forget the shelter, forget everything. We would take only what we absolutely needed. Our emergency bag, our phones, Dominique's jacket, nothing else mattered. Because every second we remained there felt like a mistake.
I glanced at Dominique. She understood immediately. Neither of us spoke. Slowly, we stood up at the same time. I grabbed the emergency bag. Dominique picked up her jacket. The stranger never looked away from the fire, never acknowledged our movement, never reacted at all. Trying to sound calm, I cleared my throat. "We're heading back to camp." Nothing. Not a word, not a nod, not even a glance. The man remained frozen in place, staring into the flames as if we didn't exist, as if he had been sitting there alone the entire time. That was enough for me. We turned and started walking. The moment the firelight disappeared behind us, the darkness of the jungle seemed to swallow everything whole. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it down the narrow trail. Neither of us ran, but we moved fast, very fast, the kind of pace people use when they're terrified of what might be behind them. For nearly 10 minutes, neither Dominique nor I said a single word. The only sounds were our footsteps and the endless noises of the rainforest surrounding us. I never looked back, partly because I was focused on the trail, mostly because I didn't want to know whether someone was following us. The hike back felt much longer than it actually was. When we finally reached the base camp, both of us were sweating and visibly shaken.
The staff immediately noticed something was wrong. One look at our faces was enough. They brought us inside and asked what happened. We described everything: the man's size, the tactical gear, the knife, the mask, the chest rig, and most importantly, the fact that he had sat silently across from us for nearly 20 minutes without saying a single word. One staff member immediately got on a radio. As he relayed the description, his expression changed. At first, he looked confused, then concerned, then genuinely uneasy. About 20 minutes later, a security officer arrived. Unlike the staff members, he seemed to take our story extremely seriously. He asked detailed questions. Which direction had the man come from? Exactly where was our campsite? How long had he been there? Did he ever speak? Did he ever stand up? Did we notice any markings on his gear? After listening carefully, the officer stepped aside and made a phone call in Portuguese. Dominique and I couldn't understand what was being said, but we could hear the tension in his voice. When he finally returned, he told us something that neither of us has forgotten. You did the right thing by leaving. That was it. No explanation, no details, just those words. I asked him directly if we had been in danger. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Only a second, but it was long enough. Then he answered, "I don't believe so." The pause before those words terrified me more than the words themselves, because it felt rehearsed, like he was choosing the safest answer, not necessarily the honest one. We stayed at the base camp for the remainder of the night. Neither of us slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that masked figure sitting motionless across the fire, silent, patient, watching the flames. The next morning, security personnel escorted a team back to our campsite. When they returned, nobody offered us any real answers. Our abandoned gear was still there. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been damaged, and apparently, there was no sign of the stranger. It was as though he had simply vanished back into the jungle. 4 days later, Dominique and I cut our trip short and flew home. The 24-hour wilderness challenge we had traveled thousands of miles to experience had lasted barely 6 hours. Even now, years later, we still talk about that night. Not as an exciting adventure, not as a funny vacation story, but a mystery we'll probably never understand. Because what still haunts me isn't what the man did, it's what he didn't do. He never threatened us, never chased us, never spoke, never even looked directly at us. He simply appeared from the darkness, sat silently across our fire, and remained there in complete, unnatural stillness. To this day, I don't know who he was, and honestly, I don't think I want to know.
Before I begin, I need to change a few details for privacy reasons. This was a widely publicized case, and although some names and minor facts have been altered, the core events happened exactly as I remember them. Several years ago, I worked at a popular hookah lounge in my city. It was one of those places where the same faces showed up almost every night. Over time, you naturally got to know people. Some became acquaintances, others became close friends, and then there were a few people you tolerated simply because they were always around. Among the regular crowd was a young woman I'll call Rachel. Rachel stood out from the rest. She was kind-hearted, polite, and surprisingly genuine in a social circle that often felt chaotic and reckless. I enjoyed talking with her whenever she came in. The problem wasn't Rachel. It was the people she surrounded herself with. Most of them had reputations that made me uncomfortable: heavy partying, drug use, questionable relationships, the kind of crowd that always seemed to attract trouble. Still, it wasn't my place to judge. Rachel was an adult, capable of making her own decisions. Eventually, she began dating another regular named Ben. Ben happened to be part of my friend group, so naturally Rachel and I became much closer. She trusted me, we talked frequently. Sometimes she'd stay after everyone else had left just to chat. For a while, she actually seemed happy, healthier, more grounded. One thing I noticed was that while she was with Ben, she spent far less time around the people I worried about. It felt like she was moving in a better direction. But unfortunately, that didn't last. After nearly a year together, Rachel and Ben broke up. The breakup devastated her. I still remember getting a message from her late one evening asking if we could meet. When I arrived, she was sitting alone in her car crying. Not the quiet kind of crying, the kind that comes from genuine heartbreak. For nearly half an hour, she sat there with tears streaming down her face while I listened. I tried to comfort her the best I could, but there wasn't much anyone could say. She loved him, and suddenly he was gone. After that night, things slowly began changing. Rachel drifted away from me. She stopped visiting the lounge as often. When she did show up, she was usually with the same crowd she used to avoid. The partying became heavier, the stories became darker, and every time I saw her, she seemed a little more lost than before. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her she was heading down a dangerous path, but every time I considered it, I stopped myself. Nobody likes being told how to live their life, so I stayed quiet. Months later, Rachel started dating a man named Greg. The moment I met him, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing specific, just an instinct, the kind of feeling that whispers in the back of your mind when someone smiles but their eyes don't. Rachel seemed different around him, more nervous, more withdrawn, and whenever Greg entered a room, people seemed to become strangely careful about what they said. Their relationship didn't last long. Exactly why they broke up, I never learned, but what happened afterward alarmed everyone. Rachel filed a restraining order against Greg. That alone told us enough. People don't usually take legal action against someone unless they're genuinely afraid. For a brief moment, I thought she had finally escaped whatever darkness surrounded him. I thought the worst was behind her. I was wrong, because only a few days later, Rachel disappeared. Without warning, without explanation, and without leaving behind a single clue.
At first, nobody panicked. People disappear for a day or two all the time, especially adults. Friends assumed Rachel needed space. Family members believed she'd show up eventually. But as the days passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Messages were never opened. Social media accounts suddenly went inactive. It was as if she had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Within a week, missing person flyers began appearing across town. Telephone poles, store windows, gas stations, everywhere. Her smiling face stared back from hundreds of posters. Underneath each photograph was the same desperate question: "Have you seen Rachel?" The atmosphere at the hookah lounge changed overnight. Conversations became quieter. Everyone seemed uneasy. People speculated constantly. Some believed she had run away. Others feared something far worse. Meanwhile, Rachel's family searched relentlessly. Her mother and father visited the lounge multiple times. Every visit broke my heart. You could see the exhaustion in their faces, the fear, the desperation, the terrible uncertainty. They asked everyone the same questions. Had anyone seen her? Had she mentioned going somewhere? Was she afraid of anyone? Did she seem upset recently? Unfortunately, I had no answers. The last meaningful conversation I'd had with Rachel was weeks before she disappeared, and every day that passed made me feel more helpless. Then something happened that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. One evening during a busy shift, a man I recognized walked into the lounge. He wasn't one of my close friends, but he was a familiar face, someone Rachel knew, someone who occasionally hung around the same social circles. At the time, there was absolutely no reason to be suspicious of him. He approached me casually. We talked for a few minutes, then the conversation shifted toward Rachel. He asked if I'd heard any updates, whether anyone had found her, whether the police had discovered anything. I told him no. Just like everyone else, I was still hoping she'd be found alive. The man nodded slowly. His expression looked concerned, sympathetic, almost heartbroken. He even spoke kindly about Rachel, said he hoped she came home soon, said her family didn't deserve this. Looking back now, that's the part that chills me, because he sounded convincing, completely convincing. There wasn't a single hint of guilt, not one crack in the mask. Nothing about his behavior seemed unusual. Before leaving, he gave me a hug, a completely normal gesture between two people worried about someone they both knew. Then he walked away, and I didn't think twice about it. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, months became nearly a year. Rachel remained missing. No sightings, no evidence, no answers. People slowly stopped talking about her, not because they didn't care, but because grief eventually becomes exhaustion. Even her missing posters began fading beneath rain and sunlight. Yet her family never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. Then, almost 1 year after Rachel disappeared, everything changed. Police announced they had made a major breakthrough, and what they uncovered would reveal a truth far darker than most of us had imagined. Because Rachel wasn't missing anymore. She had been dead for a very long time. The news hit our town like a bomb. After nearly a year of unanswered questions, endless searches, and fading hope, investigators finally uncovered the truth. And it was worse than anyone had imagined. Rachel's remains had been found. For months, her family had held on to the belief that she might still be alive somewhere, that she would eventually walk through the front door, that the nightmare would finally end. Instead, they received the kind of phone call no family should ever have to receive. The investigation that followed moved quickly. As detectives pieced together evidence, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The man Rachel had filed a restraining order against, Greg, had not accepted the end of their relationship. According to investigators, Greg had orchestrated the entire thing. Unable to control Rachel anymore, he chose a far darker solution. Police discovered that Greg had hired someone to kill her. And the person he hired was someone many of us already knew. Someone who had been standing among us the entire time. Someone who had laughed with us, talked with us, and pretended to search for Rachel alongside everyone else. When detectives revealed his identity, I felt physically sick, because it was the same man who had walked into the hookah lounge months earlier, the same man who had approached me during my shift, the same man who had asked me whether I had heard any news about Rachel, the same man who had hugged me. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had to be some mistake. My mind refused to accept it. I replayed our conversation over and over again. His voice, his expressions, his questions, the concern he seemed to show.
Every memory suddenly felt poisoned, because while I was standing there hoping Rachel would be found alive, he already knew exactly where she was, because he had been the one who took her life. That realization haunted me for years. It still does. People often ask whether I blame myself. The answer is complicated. No, I don't blame myself for what happened to Rachel. The responsibility belongs entirely to the monsters who chose to hurt her. But I do carry regret. I regret every moment I stayed silent when I saw her drifting toward dangerous people. I regret every time I thought about warning her and decided it wasn't my place. I regret not being a stronger friend. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe she still would have ended up crossing paths with Greg. Maybe the outcome would have been exactly the same. I'll never know. That's the cruel part. When someone dies, your mind becomes obsessed with alternate timelines, different choices, different conversations, different endings. You spend years wondering if one small action might have changed everything. Eventually, Greg and the man he hired were convicted. Both were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars, where they belong. The town slowly moved on. Businesses reopened, people returned to their routines. The missing posters disappeared. But for those of us who knew Rachel, moving on was never that simple. Every now and then, something reminds me of her. A song, a place, a random conversation. And for a few moments, she's back in my memory, exactly as she was before everything happened. Laughing, smiling, talking about her future. A future she never got the chance to live. But the memory that never leaves me isn't from before she disappeared. It's from that evening in the hookah lounge. The moment I stood face to face with her killer and didn't know it. The moment he looked me in the eye and asked if I'd heard any news about Rachel, knowing the entire time that she was already dead, knowing the entire time that he was responsible. That memory has followed me for years, and I suspect it always will. Because some monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they sit right beside you, shake your hand, offer you a hug, and smile while carrying a terrible secret no one else can see.
About 18 months ago, I experienced something that changed the way I look at my home forever. I've gone back and forth countless times about whether I should tell this story. Not because I'm embarrassed, not because I'm afraid people won't believe me, but because writing it out forces me to see the entire picture at once. And when you see the entire picture, every small incident suddenly becomes part of something much darker. At the time, each event seemed harmless enough on its own. A strange coincidence, an unusual encounter, something easy to explain away. But when you place them all together, a pattern emerges, and that pattern still terrifies me. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where children ride bicycles in the middle of the street during summer afternoons. Neighbors wave to each other while mowing their lawns. Dogs bark behind white picket fences. Nothing exciting ever happens here. That's exactly why what happened stood out so much. I'd lived there for nearly 6 years. I knew most of my neighbors by name. Not closely, but well enough to stop and chat while collecting mail or taking out the trash. The neighborhood felt safe, predictable, comfortable. I also lived alone. That fact became increasingly important as the events unfolded.
At the time, I worked a hybrid schedule, 3 days a week from home, 2 days in the office. My home office was located in a spare bedroom on the second floor. The desk faced a window overlooking the narrow strip of grass between my house and my neighbor Carol's fence. It wasn't much to look at, just a small side yard most people ignored. One Tuesday morning in early March, I was sitting at my desk answering emails when movement caught my attention. At first, I barely glanced up. Then, I froze. There was a man standing in my side yard. Not walking through it, not working on anything, not checking utilities. Just standing there, perfectly still, watching my house. He stood roughly 20 feet from the window. Middle-aged, average height, dark jacket, dark pants. Nothing particularly memorable about his appearance, except for one thing: the way he stared. His attention seemed completely fixed on the house itself, as if he were studying it, memorizing it. I watched him for several seconds. He didn't move, didn't reach for a phone, didn't look around, just stood there, watching. An uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The moment I did, the man turned calmly and walked away. No rush, no panic, no attempt to hide. He simply walked around the front of the house and disappeared from view. I immediately moved to the front window, just in time to see him walking down the sidewalk, leaving the neighborhood at a normal pace. He never looked back. I stood there for nearly a minute, trying to understand what I'd just seen. At first, I convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was looking at houses for sale. Maybe he was a contractor. Maybe he was lost. The longer I thought about it, the less unusual it seemed. Eventually, I returned to work and pushed the incident out of my mind. For nearly 2 weeks, I barely thought about it. Life returned to normal: work, sleep, groceries, the usual routine. Then, on another work-from-home day, something happened that brought the memory rushing back. Around lunchtime, I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when I heard a sound at the back of the house. A soft, metallic click, almost like someone lightly testing a door handle. The noise was brief, quiet, but unmistakable. I immediately stopped what I was doing and listened. The house fell silent. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. Slowly, I walked toward the back door, a strange feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. The same feeling I'd experienced while watching that man stand in my yard weeks earlier. The feeling that someone was paying far too much attention to my house. I approached the back door slowly. The small window in the center of the door gave me a partial view of the backyard. I looked through it. Nothing. The yard was completely empty. No movement, no people, no animals. Just the quiet backyard sitting beneath a gray afternoon sky. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the sound, but I knew I hadn't. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cool air hit my face as I scanned the fence line. Everything appeared normal. The gate was closed, the grass was undisturbed. And yet, something felt wrong. I checked the handle. Still locked. No visible damage. No obvious signs that anyone had been there. After a few minutes of searching, I reluctantly went back inside. That evening, while my neighbor Tom was collecting his mail, I mentioned both incidents. The man standing in my side yard and the strange noise at the back door. Tom listened carefully, then shrugged. He suggested it might have been a raccoon, or maybe a stray cat bumping into the door. Honestly, his explanation sounded reasonable. I wanted it to be true, so I accepted it, at least for the moment. That night, I double-checked every lock before going to bed. Not because I was scared, just because the incidents were lingering in the back of my mind. The next 11 days passed without incident. Then,
it happened again. Another work-from-home day, another late morning, another glance toward the side yard window, and there he was, the same man, standing in the exact same place, watching my house. For a moment, my heart stopped. The dark jacket, the same posture, the same unnatural stillness. This time, I was on a video conference call for work. I forced myself to remain calm while speaking, trying not to let the panic show on my face. After about 30 seconds, I excused myself from the meeting and muted my microphone. Then I rushed to the window. Just like before, the man was already leaving, walking calmly toward the street. No hurry, no concern. Almost as if he knew exactly how much time he had before being noticed. I ran to the front of the house. By the time I reached the window, he was already nearing the end of the block. Once again, he never looked back. That was the moment I stopped dismissing everything as coincidence. I called the police non-emergency line. The officer who answered was professional and polite. I explained both sightings, the exact dates, the approximate times, the strange behavior. He took notes and assured me that patrol units would keep an eye on the neighborhood. Then he gave me advice that would soon prove very important. Consider installing security cameras. The same afternoon, I ordered a video doorbell camera online. 2 days later, it arrived. I installed it myself. One camera covered the front entrance. Another, smaller camera watched the back door. Both connected directly to an app on my phone. Almost immediately, I felt safer. If the man returned, I would finally have proof. For nearly 3 weeks, nothing happened. The cameras recorded normal suburban life. Delivery drivers, kids chasing basketballs, neighbors walking dogs, Carol's cat wandering across my front walkway. Nothing suspicious, nothing threatening. Slowly, my anxiety began fading. Maybe the police were right. Maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe the man was harmless. Then, one morning, everything changed. I woke up and checked my phone before getting out of bed, a habit I'd developed since installing the cameras. There were 4 motion alerts from the front camera, all between 2 and 3 in the morning. My stomach tightened immediately. I opened the first clip. A man was standing on the sidewalk directly in front of my house, not on my property, just outside it, standing perfectly still, facing my home. The second clip was recorded 11 minutes later. He hadn't moved. The third clip appeared 20 minutes after that. This time he had moved closer, much closer. Now he stood at the edge of my front walkway, right where public property ended and my property began. Watching, waiting. The fourth clip appeared several minutes later. The walkway was empty. He was gone. I sat upright in bed staring at the screen. 40 minutes. 40 full minutes spent outside my house in the middle of the night. Not walking by, not passing through, not lost. Watching, studying, calculating. And for the first time, I realized something truly disturbing. This wasn't random. Someone was learning my routines. Someone was taking their time. Someone was slowly becoming familiar with my home.
The moment I finished reviewing the footage, I called the police again. This time I emailed them the video clips directly. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived at my house. Together, we reviewed every recording. Neither officer dismissed what they saw. In fact, their expressions became increasingly serious as the footage played. Afterward, they walked the perimeter of my property. They checked the doors, the windows, the fence line. Everything appeared secure. Before leaving, one of the officers said something that stayed with me. The behavior is consistent with someone casing a property. I already knew what that meant. Someone studying a house before attempting to break into it. Someone gathering information, learning schedules, identifying weaknesses, looking for opportunities. That night, sleep became almost impossible. Every sound outside seemed suspicious. Every creak of the house made me sit upright in bed. For the next week, I checked my camera feeds obsessively. Then came the morning that truly frightened me. It was a Saturday. I woke up, went downstairs to make coffee, and immediately noticed something strange. The back door was unlocked. I froze, my hand still resting on the kitchen counter. The door was always locked. Always. I lived alone. Nobody else had access to the house, and I hadn't used that door in over a week. Slowly, I opened the camera app, my heart pounding harder with every second. The footage from the previous night showed nothing. No motion alerts, no visitors, no suspicious activity. Nothing, which somehow made it even worse. I approached the door and examined the lock closely. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I noticed faint scratches around the keyhole, tiny marks, easy to overlook, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I had no way of knowing whether they were new. Maybe they'd been there for months. Maybe they appeared overnight, but combined with everything else, they felt significant. Very significant. I called the police again and requested an officer come to the house. When he arrived, he carefully inspected the lock. After several minutes, he gave me an answer that sent a chill down my spine. The scratches were consistent with someone attempting to manipulate or pick the lock. He couldn't determine when it happened, and he couldn't confirm whether anyone had successfully entered the house, but someone had almost certainly worked on that lock. The realization was horrifying. For 2 months, I had watched this pattern develop. First, the man stood in my yard. Then came the suspicious noise at the back door. Then he returned to watch the house again. Then he spent 40 minutes outside in the middle of the night. And now someone had apparently tampered with my lock. Individually, each incident seemed explainable. Together, they formed something much darker. A plan. A patient, methodical plan. That same day, I replaced every lock in the house. A locksmith reinforced both door frames. I installed additional motion lights. I purchased a door alarm that would activate if anyone opened the back entrance. And after that, everything stopped. Completely. No more sightings. No more strange sounds. No more motion alerts at 2 in the morning. The man never returned. At least not that I ever saw. The police were never able to identify him. The footage wasn't clear enough. No arrests were made. No suspects were found. The case simply faded away. But I never forgot what happened, because the most disturbing part wasn't the possibility of a break-in. It was the patience. Whoever that man was, he wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't rush. He spent 2 full months studying my life, learning my schedule, learning which entrances were vulnerable, learning exactly when I was alone. Every sighting happened on Tuesday or Thursday, the days my car sat in the driveway, the days he knew I would be home. That wasn't luck. That was observation, calculation, preparation. Even now, 18 months later, I still check my security cameras every morning before I get out of bed. Some habits become impossible to break, especially when they were born from fear. Sometimes I sit by the window in my home office and stare at that narrow strip of grass beside the fence, the same place where I first saw him. And every once in a while, I imagine looking up from my computer and seeing that dark figure standing there again, motionless, silent, watching, waiting, studying my house from the shadows, the same way he did before. And that thought alone is enough to make my skin crawl, because somewhere out there is a man I never identified, a man who knew far more about my home than he ever should have. And I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't installed those cameras when I did.
This happened about 6 years ago when I was 17 years old. At the time, I didn't fully understand how disturbing it was. Looking back now as an adult, it honestly feels like the beginning of a horror movie. When I was around 15 or 16, I went through a phase where I was obsessed with hair extensions. Every few months, I'd save up money and visit the same salon. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small local salon owned by 2 women who always seemed incredibly friendly. They were the kind of stylists who remembered everything about their clients. They knew my name, they remembered details about school, They always complimented me whenever I came in. "You are such a beautiful girl. I can't believe you're only 15. You must have boys chasing after you." As a teenage girl, hearing things like that felt flattering. I trusted them, and after 6 or 7 appointments, I felt completely comfortable around them. Over time, however, the conversation started becoming a little strange. At first, it was harmless. Questions about whether I had a boyfriend, whether I liked anyone, whether I wanted to start dating. I always laughed and gave the same answer: maybe when the right guy comes along. One afternoon during a routine appointment, one of the women brought up the subject again. This time, though, the conversation took an unexpected turn. She started talking about her brother. Apparently, he lived overseas in Africa. According to her, he was handsome, successful, and looking for a wife. Then she smiled at me and said something that immediately made me uncomfortable. "You should meet him one day." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she was joking. Then I asked how old he was. "Early 20s, she replied. My smile faded instantly. I was 15 years old. The age difference alone made the suggestion feel bizarre. Trying to remain polite, I simply told her I wasn't interested. I expected the conversation to end there. Instead, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed it. She seemed disappointed, almost annoyed. Then she leaned closer and said something I'll never forget. "Why not? He'll take care of you." She laughed. "Maybe he'll take you back to Africa and make you an African queen." The other stylist laughed too. I forced a smile. Inside, I felt uneasy. The comment didn't sound like a joke anymore. Still, they had always been kind to me, so I convinced myself I was overthinking it. When I left that day, I told a few friends about the strange conversation. We laughed about it, made jokes, then eventually forgot about it altogether. Life moved on. Nearly 2 years passed. I turned 17, got my driver's license, graduated from worrying about high school drama to worrying about slightly bigger problems. One day, I decided I wanted hair extensions again, mostly because I missed having long hair, and honestly, I was curious to see my old stylists, so I scheduled an appointment. The visit felt completely normal, the same friendly atmosphere, the same small talk, the same compliments. For 2 hours, everything seemed exactly the way I remembered it. By the time they finished, my hair looked great. I thanked them and started gathering my things. That's when one of the stylists stopped me. "We've got a new hair treatment oil we'd like you to try." I turned back. "Really? Completely free." Now, if there's one thing I've learned since then, it's that nothing in life is truly free. But 17-year-old me wasn't exactly known for making brilliant decisions. A free treatment for damaged hair sounded amazing, so I agreed to come back the next day. A decision I would regret almost immediately. Because when I walked into that salon the following afternoon, there was a man sitting inside, and the moment I saw him, something felt wrong.
The moment I walked into the salon, I noticed him. He was sitting quietly near the back of the room. At first glance, there was nothing obviously threatening about him. He appeared to be in his early 20s. Average clothing, average appearance, just another customer. Or so I thought. I smiled politely and took a seat while one of the stylists prepared the hair treatment. The salon was unusually quiet that afternoon. No other clients, no background conversations, just me, the 2 women, and the man. Then I realized something. He was staring at me. Not glancing, not occasionally looking over. Staring. Every single time I looked in his direction, his eyes were already fixed on me. Watching, following my movements, studying me. The feeling immediately made my stomach tighten. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself I was imagining things.
but it only got worse. Whenever I spoke, he would let out a strange little laugh, a soft, awkward chuckle. Not because anything was funny, just because I had spoken. The sound sent chills down my spine. The entire appointment lasted less than 30 minutes, yet it felt much longer. Every second stretched uncomfortably. Every glance toward him increased my anxiety. Something about him felt deeply wrong. Not dangerous in an obvious way. Dangerous in the way a predator can seem calm before it decides to act. Finally, the treatment was finished. Relieved, I gathered my purse and thanked the stylists. I couldn't wait to leave. I was already halfway to the door when one of the women suddenly stopped me. "Oh, before you go." I turned around. She smiled brightly and pointed toward the man. "This is my brother." For a moment, I didn't understand. Then everything clicked into place. The comments from years earlier, the jokes about becoming an African queen, the constant questions about boyfriends, the insistence that I meet him someday. This was him, the brother, the same man they had been talking about since I was 15 years old. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Before I could respond, the stylist continued, "Why don't you let him walk you to your car?" I immediately shook my head. "No thank you, I'm okay." The request seemed strange. My car wasn't parked directly outside. It was about 10-minute walk through a nearby parking structure. There was absolutely no reason for a complete stranger to escort me there. The stylist laughed. "Oh, come on, he'll keep you company." Again, I refused. Politely, firmly. "No thank you." The brother finally spoke. His voice was low, almost emotionless. "I walk with you." Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. I smiled awkwardly. "No, really, I'm fine." The women kept insisting. The brother kept staring, and I kept saying no, over and over. "No thank you. I'm okay. I don't need anyone to walk me." Eventually, I stopped trying to be polite. I simply turned and left. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade. Long shadows stretched across the narrow alley that connected the salon to the parking area. I walked quickly, eager to put distance between myself and the salon. Then I heard footsteps behind me. My heart sank. I already knew who it was. I turned around. The brother was following me, about 6 feet behind, not speaking, not smiling, just walking, matching my pace perfectly. I stopped. He stopped. I turned toward him, trying one last time to end the situation. "You really don't need to walk me to my car." He stared at me, then replied in broken English, "No, I come with you." The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It sounded like a decision. And suddenly, the walk to my car felt much longer than 10 minutes.
At that point, I was terrified. The parking structure was mostly empty. The evening light was fading fast, and despite repeatedly telling him to leave, the man continued following me. Sometimes he walked a few feet behind me. Sometimes he moved up beside me. But no matter what I did, he stayed close. The entire situation felt surreal, like I had somehow wandered into a nightmare that nobody else could see. I kept looking around for other people, anyone, a security guard, a couple walking to their car, another driver, but the parking area seemed almost deserted. The farther we walked, the more isolated everything felt. My hands were trembling, my heart was pounding, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reached the section of the parking structure where my car was parked. I stopped walking, then turned around to face him. I was done being polite. "Thank you for walking with me," I said firmly, "but I don't need you to follow me anymore." For the first time during the entire walk, he smiled,
It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that immediately makes your stomach drop. Then he asked a question. "Where is your boyfriend?" Without thinking, I answered honestly. "I don't have one." The second those words left my mouth, I wished I could take them back. Something changed in his expression. A strange excitement flashed across his face. Nearby was an elevator leading to the upper level of the parking garage. He immediately pressed the call button. The elevator doors opened a few moments later. Then he turned toward me, looked directly into my eyes, and said the words that still haunt me years later. "You come home with me." I froze. My mind struggled to process what I had just heard. Then he continued, "I make you my African queen." The words sounded almost identical to the comments his sister had made years earlier, except now there was nothing playful about them, nothing funny, nothing harmless. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm, hard. The force shocked me. 1 second, I was standing there. The next, he was pulling me toward the elevator, trying to drag me inside. Panic exploded through my body. I started screaming. Not yelling, not shouting, screaming. The kind of scream that comes from pure survival instinct. My entire body went into fight or flight mode. I pulled back with everything I had, but he was much stronger than me. I was 17, small, terrified, and completely overwhelmed. For a horrifying moment, I genuinely believed I was about to disappear into that elevator, that nobody would know where I went, that nobody would hear me. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed through the parking structure. "Hey!" The man froze. Footsteps thundered across the concrete floor. A stranger was running toward us, a middle-aged man who had apparently heard my screams from somewhere nearby. The moment my attacker saw him approaching, everything changed. He released my arm instantly, turned around, and ran. Not walked, not hurried, ran. Within seconds, he disappeared deeper into the parking structure and was gone. I collapsed against a nearby vehicle, shaking uncontrollably. The stranger stayed with me until I calmed down enough to speak. He asked if I was hurt, if I needed the police, if I wanted him to stay. I don't remember much of that conversation. My mind was still trying to process what had almost happened. What I do remember is feeling overwhelming relief, because if that man hadn't heard me, I honestly don't know how that story would have ended. Looking back now, there are several things that disturb me. The fact that the salon employees had spent years trying to introduce me to him. The fact that they continued encouraging the situation after I repeatedly said no. The fact that they invited me back under the excuse of a free treatment. And most disturbing of all, the fact that his obsession seemed to have started when I was only 15 years old. I've never gone back to that salon, not once. I never spoke to either of the women again, and I never saw the brother after that day. But every now and then, I still think about that elevator, those closing doors, his hand wrapped around my arm, and the terrifying realization that a complete stranger believed I belonged to him. To the man who saved me that evening, wherever you are now, thank you. Because there's a very real chance that your decision to investigate a scream changed the course of my entire life. And to the man who wanted to make me his African queen, let's never meet again.
For most people, teaching first grade probably doesn't sound dangerous. When they picture an elementary school teacher, they imagine colorful classrooms, finger paintings, spelling tests, and children learning how to read. What they don't imagine is fear. Real fear. The kind that leaves your hands shaking long after the danger has passed. At the time this happened, I was teaching first grade in a low-income community with a reputation for violence. The area struggled with gang activity, drug trafficking, prostitution, and child neglect. Sadly, difficult stories weren't unusual there.
In fact, just a couple of years before this incident, local police had arrested a woman who had exploited her own daughters in exchange for drug money. Stories like that weren't common, but they happened often enough that teachers learned to stay alert, especially when it came to children. Because children rarely tell you directly when something is wrong. Instead, they show you, sometimes through behavior, sometimes through fear, and sometimes through physical evidence. That school year had only recently begun when a new student joined my class. I'll call her Grace. Grace immediately caught my attention. She was unusually quiet, not shy in the normal first-grade way. This felt different. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. She avoided eye contact. She flinched whenever adults raised their voices, and she constantly seemed nervous, as though she were waiting for something bad to happen. Years of teaching had taught me that those behaviors could sometimes indicate trauma or abuse, so I paid close attention, not because I wanted to accuse anyone, but because protecting children is part of the job, a responsibility I take very seriously. One Monday afternoon, I took my students outside for recess. The weather was warm enough that many of the children were wearing shorts. As the class played, something on Grace's legs caught my attention. At first, I thought it was some kind of rash. Then I looked closer. My stomach dropped. Her legs were covered in small, circular indentations. Red marks stretched from her calves up toward her thighs. The injuries looked painful, and they were far too organized to be accidental. I quietly called Grace over, trying not to alarm her, trying not to embarrass her in front of the other children. When she walked over, I gently asked what had happened. She answered immediately, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. "Oh, Daddy had to use the brush on me again." For a moment, I didn't understand. "The brush?" I asked. Grace nodded. "Because I was bad." Then she shrugged, as though this was completely normal, as though every child experienced the same thing. And suddenly, the horrifying truth clicked into place. The marks weren't a rash. They weren't bug bites. They weren't from a fall. Those circular impressions matched the bristles of a brush. Someone had beaten her hard enough to leave visible injuries that remained days later. I felt sick, but I kept my expression calm. The last thing I wanted was to frighten her. After recess, I documented everything carefully. Then I made the call I was legally and morally required to make: Child Protective Services. As a teacher, I'm a mandated reporter. When there is reasonable suspicion of abuse, you don't look the other way. You don't wait. You don't hope someone else handles it. You report it. That same afternoon, investigators arrived at the school. They interviewed Grace privately, photographed the injuries, and began their own investigation. Once CPS became involved, the case moved beyond me. I wasn't told what happened afterward. I wasn't given updates. I wasn't informed of their findings. All I knew was that I had done my job. Or at least, I thought that was the end of my involvement. I was wrong, because a few days later, Grace disappeared from my classroom, and not long after that, her father came looking for me.
At first, I assumed Grace had simply transferred to another school. That happens all the time. Families move, students change districts, life happens. But something about the timing felt wrong. One day she was sitting quietly in the front row of my classroom. The next day, her desk was empty. Then another day passed, and another. Soon it became obvious she wasn't coming back. I never received an explanation. No farewell, no paperwork, nothing. Just an empty chair where a frightened little girl used to sit. As upsetting as it was, I tried to focus on my other students. There wasn't much else I could do. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least normal enough.
Then one evening changed everything. It was late, around 5:30 p.m. Most teachers had already gone home. The hallways were nearly empty. The building was quiet. I was finishing paperwork and preparing lesson plans for the next day. Eventually, I gathered my things and headed toward the parking lot. The sun was beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. I remember feeling exhausted, ready to go home, ready to leave work behind for the day. The moment I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. A large pickup truck was parked directly behind my car. Not near it, not beside it, directly behind it, blocking me in. I stopped walking, confused. Then the driver's side door flew open. A man stepped out, and my blood ran cold. Even before he started moving, I knew exactly who he was. Grace's father. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of physical presence that immediately commands attention. But what terrified me wasn't his size. It was what he was carrying. A baseball bat. A heavy wooden bat, gripped tightly in both hands. The sight of it made my stomach drop instantly. Then he started yelling. Not speaking, not arguing. Yelling. Profanities exploded from his mouth as he stormed toward me. Every word filled with rage, every sentence dripping with hatred. He accused me of ruining his life. He blamed me for Child Protective Services taking his daughter. He called me every name imaginable. His face was red with fury. His eyes looked completely unhinged. And through all of it, he kept waving that bat. At first, I tried reasoning with him. I attempted to explain that I was legally required to report suspected abuse, that my responsibility was to protect children. But he wasn't listening. Nothing I said mattered. In his mind, I was the enemy, the person responsible for everything that had happened. As he moved closer, reality hit me. This wasn't an angry parent demanding answers. This was a man looking for revenge. A man who wanted someone to blame. And at that moment, that someone was me. My mind raced through possible options. Run? Impossible. He was much bigger and faster than I was. Get into my car? Not a chance. I'd be trapped while he smashed the windows with the bat. Fight? That wasn't even remotely realistic. I weighed barely a fraction of what he did. For a terrifying moment, I genuinely didn't know what to do. The parking lot felt enormous and empty. The nearest building suddenly seemed miles away. And standing between me and safety was an enraged man carrying a weapon. Then I saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not frustration. Something worse. The cold certainty of someone who had already decided what they wanted to do. And that's when I realized this situation was far more dangerous than I had first believed.
The moment I realized how serious the situation was, every ounce of pride disappeared. I wasn't thinking about dignity. I wasn't thinking about professionalism. I was thinking about survival. So I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed, loudly as I possibly could. Years of teaching first graders had given me a surprisingly powerful voice. The kind of voice capable of cutting through playground boys and chaotic classrooms. That evening, it may have saved my life. Help! The word echoed across the parking lot. Again and again, I screamed. The father froze for a brief moment, clearly surprised. Then his rage intensified. He continued shouting threats while gripping the baseball bat, promising revenge, promising punishment, promising all the things he planned to do to me for reporting him. But by then, other people had heard me. Across the street, doors began opening. Neighbors stepped outside. Several parents recognized me immediately. One of the advantages of teaching in a small community is that people know who you are. Many of the adults living nearby had children who attended the school. Some had children I personally taught. Within moments, several people started moving toward the parking lot. The father noticed them too, but instead of calming down, he became even more aggressive. He screamed louder, swore louder, and continued making threats while pacing back and forth with the bat. One woman immediately called 911. Meanwhile, two fathers of former students positioned themselves between me and Grace's father. Neither man acted aggressively. They simply stood there, creating a barrier, making it clear that if he wanted to reach me, he would have to go through them first. I cannot adequately describe the relief I felt. For the first time since the confrontation began, I realized I might actually be okay. The father continued raging. His voice echoed through the parking lot, threat after threat, insult after insult, the baseball bat swinging through the air as he shouted. Then, finally, the sound of sirens approached. Police vehicles arrived quickly, very quickly. The officers stepped out and immediately took control of the scene. Even with police standing in front of him, the father refused to calm down. He continued shouting, continued threatening, continued blaming me for everything. The officers eventually placed him under arrest. As they escorted him toward a patrol vehicle, he twisted around and continued yelling in my direction. The look in his eyes is something I'll never forget. Pure hatred. The kind that leaves a mark on your memory long after the danger is gone. Afterward, officers took my statement. Several witnesses gave theirs as well. I never learned every charge that was filed against him. What I do know is that the police took the threats very seriously. And honestly, so did I. Because despite never physically touching me, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that he intended to harm me if given the opportunity. For the remainder of that school year, local police officers escorted me to my car every afternoon. Some people might find that excessive. I didn't. Not after what happened. Not after seeing the fury in that man's eyes. Thankfully, the officers in our community were incredible, professional, compassionate, and determined to ensure my safety. But perhaps the strangest part of this entire story happened several weeks later. One afternoon, a young man approached me outside a local store. I recognized him immediately. He had ties to one of the area's street gangs. Normally, that would have made me nervous. Instead, he surprised me. He smiled and introduced himself. Then he told me something I never expected to hear. Years earlier, he had taught his younger sister. Apparently, she had spoken highly of me, very highly. Then he casually informed me that several people in his circle were keeping an eye on things, just in case Grace's father attempted to come after me again. I remember standing there completely speechless. A first-grade teacher receiving protection from local gang members wasn't something I ever imagined would happen. The entire conversation felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Yet strangely enough, it was also comforting. Because in that moment, I realized something important. The community wasn't standing behind me because I was special. They were standing behind me because they believed protecting children mattered. Whether it was concerned parents, police officers, former students, or even people living lives far different from my own, everyone understood one simple truth. A child deserves to be safe, and no adult should ever be punished for trying to protect them. Years have passed from that day. I still think about Grace sometimes. I wonder where she is. I wonder if she's safe. I wonder if she remembers the teacher who noticed the bruises on her legs and decided to make a phone call. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. But if she's out there somewhere, I hope she's living a better life. Because despite the fear, despite the threats, despite the baseball bat and the terrifying confrontation that followed, I would make the same call again, every single time. Because some things are more important than being comfortable. and protecting a child will always be one of them.